This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to a special five-part podcast series on third-party management, sponsored by Diligent. In this part one, I visit with Michael Parker on risk mitigation. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to our inaugural episode in our five-part series sponsored by Diligent. I am thrilled today to have with me Michael Parker. Michael is Director, Advisory and Consulting Services. Michael, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Happy to be here, Tom. Thanks for the invitation.
Mike, could you tell us a little bit, or Michael, could you tell us your professional background and your current role?
Absolutely. So I've been in the compliance industry roughly 6 years at this point, and I have a background in government services, working with the Department of Homeland Security, and then I went back into tech at Apple Computer. Entered consulting services, and in my role here at Diligent, I have led a number of different teams from support to client success to implementations. So as a result of that, I've worked with over 300, maybe 350 clients in the ABAC space, so compliance, ethics, and legal as well. So with that introduction, or with those items combined with having worked with consultants such as Christy Grant Hart and Michael Volkov, the knowledge has increased over the year. And as we all know, things are consistently changing. So keeping up with those. But that's my experience, Tom.
So, Michael, the board of directors has a role in compliance, and it's oftentimes seen as an oversight role, and that's absolutely correct from the legal perspective. But occasionally, they'll want to go into the weeds. And one of the areas they want to go into the weeds the most is third-party risk management. And that's because that's still perceived to be the highest risk
Mhm.
in compliance programs. So I wanted to maybe start with a question to you about how or why, I guess, how would a compliance professional approach a board of directors around the issue of a third-party risk management platform and program? And what are some of the things that you would counsel them to talk to the board about?
Absolutely. So, first off, I want to point out that without buy in from your executive leadership and your board, you're not going to be successful in implementing a program of this nature. But there are several compelling reasons in order to put a program of this in place. Number one, your job is to protect the assets. As a compliance professional, that is your job, protect the assets of the business. How do we go about this? Well, putting a platform in place that is robust lends itself to a number of different benefits. One, we gain efficiencies, right? So you've got people doing things over email, spreadsheets, attaching documents into some sort of repository, and there's not a full level single source of truth. Everything's all over the place. Then, in some circumstances, you might have multiple approvers that things need to go through. And so, what we want to do, Tom, is we want to implement a risk based approach into a single source of truth that allows us to implement an effective diligence program. And what does that mean? Well, there are two primary elements to an effective diligence program when we're looking at protecting our assets. Number one, we need to increase our defensibility. Number two, we need to increase our auditability. So enhance our defensibility and increase our auditability. If somebody comes knocking, we can show and illustrate that we have done our due diligence to mitigate any sort of risk of doing business with this third party. As we know, third party vendors, third parties altogether, regardless of what they're in, with large enterprise companies, they're critical to not only our supply chain, but just doing business with a number of different types of third parties, be they distributors, resellers, custom brokers, manufacturers, agents, sales agents, things of that nature, right? So we need a platform that can screen. What are we screening for? Well, in this space, the focus is primarily anti-bribery and anti-corruption. But as we know, regulations are constantly changing. And we have a need to keep up with the regulations across various government entities and organizations throughout the world. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But you need to screen them. What are we screening against? We're screening for anti-bribery, anti-corruption, but we've also got tools that allow us to screen for other considerations, like the recently introduced German Supply Chain Act that focuses on human trafficking and human slavery. So that's new to the ABAC space in the sense of we need to be able to screen those in a single source of truth. So we're looking at those things. We're looking at politically exposed persons, state-owned entities, watch lists, embargoes. You think about the recent situation with Russia and Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine, that changed so much in almost everything in that region that compliance professionals need to look for. So, how do we do this? Well, here's the thing, Tom. You've got a single source of truth and you've got a platform in place that allows you to do the screening. That screening tool is consistently updated. So, whereby in the past we focused more on anti bribery and anti corruption, now we've got tools in place within our platform that allow us to screen against not just FCPA focused items, the French Sapin, the United Kingdom Bribery Act, but also we can screen against these types of things, the German sources, as it were, to help us look at all of those elements as well as the human supply chain or the German Supply Chain Act related to human trafficking and related to human slavery. Now, why does a board want this? Well, in addition to all that, you might need to send forms out, questionnaires. And then we need to put a risk-based approach in place that tells us who are they, where are they doing business on our behalf, are they going to be interacting with the government on our behalf? So all of those elements come together into our risk-based approach, and we start to form what's called a dossier of information, as I call it. We've got our screening results. We've got potentially a due diligence questionnaire. Perhaps we've taken an extra level of diligence whereby we have put an investigation in place, and we take all of these tools to evaluate the dossier of information and to be able to lead us to a decision that shows that we have done our diligence and we've approved or denied doing business with this third party.
Michael, let me pick up on one of the points you raised because you started off, I think, correctly noting that we were largely or perhaps primarily focused on anti-corruption compliance to comply with laws such as the FCPA, but then you expanded out uh, other types of third parties. And you mentioned the German Supply Chain Act. You mentioned the UK Modern Slavery Act. And here in the United States, we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think we're on round 11 of sanctions were announced just this past week, and the most robust sanctions yet. So we're in an ever-changing environment. But so my question is, it's not simply third parties on the sales side around corruption. It's third parties, period. And
Yes,
if you don't know who you're doing business with, you could be maybe potentially in a big world of hurt. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
I can indeed. And another point, just real quick while I'm thinking about it, that I wanted to mention, we can come back to this if you like, Tom. But the board needs visibility. And so, one of the things that a platform does, in addition to everything that I just told you, is provide visual analytics in order to look at what our dispersion of population is, the high risk, et cetera. So, to expand back to ask that last part of that question again, I'm sorry, Tom.
So with the anti-corruption, when you focus on third parties, you typically focus on the sales side.
Right.
But what I heard you say is, Tom, it's not third parties on the sales side. It's third parties, period.
That's correct.
Because you can be caught using underage labor. You can be caught using slave labor. You can be caught having a cyber attack through a vendor. Those are
Indeed.
all third parties. And so I was
Correct.
wondering if you could give a few words around, it's not third parties on the sales side, it's
Sure.
third parties, period. And
It
how
is
the
indeed.
Diligent platform really helps with that overall third party holistic approach.
Well, again, back to that earlier point, we need to know what are they going to be doing for us? And then we'll classify them accordingly and put a definition around that. And candidly, we'll score them into that risk-based approach, right? So, as far as whom it extends to, you need to know not only what your supply chain distribution is doing, but you need to understand the risk of the compliance piece. So, let's consider this. Let's talk about a freight forwarder. Simple, not somebody we might think of, but you've got goods coming from overseas. So, there's your shipping company. Then they've got to get into the country. There are your customs brokers. Then we've got to freight forward. And from there, we've got a distributor, goes to the distributor, then it goes to the reseller. You've got risk all the way around that circle on each of those third parties because even though you've got subcontractors to the third parties, So fourth party diligence is starting to come up. You need to know who you're doing business with, regardless of what they're doing for you. If they are doing something for you, you have an obligation to mitigate the risk accordingly.
I love the way you phrase that. If they are doing something for you, there's a risk.
Yes,
Now, it may be a high risk, it may be a low risk, but there's a risk. And you can't manage that risk until you've assessed it.
agreed.
You've also touched on another part that is frankly near and dear to my heart. And that's, you said the auditability or audit trail. I'm going to rephrase that to the thing I say every speech I ever give, which is the three most important parts of a compliance program are the following: document, document, document. And the reason the documentation is critical is that if a regulator comes knocking, if it's not documented in a regulator's mind, it never existed. But we're talking about boards here. We're talking about internally. And so, from the internal perspective, number one, yes, a board has oversight responsibility, not tactical or even strategic responsibility, but they may want to test. And so, the auditability of your own program is critical. But the second part, before we, once again, till we get to the regulators, is if you don't have it in an audible format, you'll never know what you have. So I was wondering if you might talk about how the information inputted into the system, such as you guys have, really helps look at things from a much more holistic perspective.
Sure. So let's just talk about an audit log, right? Records every activity in the system, but it also helps us in a third party record see what the activity has been done, right? And so we're looking at not only the mechanical and tactical actions, we're going back to that dossier of information that I was referring to. And how did we adjudicate the hits? So think red flags that came up from our screening. If we received unexpected answers in our due diligence questionnaire, how are we adjudicating and mitigating those? And then going back to the hits, we might need to do additional remediation. So there's your notes, right? Take your notes. You've got your attachments with your documents, all of those sorts of things. What actions did you take and what did you review so that if you have an allegation and the Department of Justice comes knocking, you can show them that you performed your diligence to mitigate that risk and hopefully reduce or eliminate any sort of fine that might be imposed.
We've also talked about a fair number of different laws in this podcast, and I won't go through the laundry list again, but I want to use that to really emphasize something you said, which is the ever changing nature of rules, regulations, and laws. And it could be a new law, which is a lengthy process, but it could be a change in regulation, like the 11th round of sanctions. Why is it
Mhm.
so critical to have a mechanism to keep up with the ever changing rules, regulations, and laws?
Mitigating risk. I keep going back to that mitigating risk. But consider this, if you're not keeping up, then there is a potential for somebody to come knocking, right? So, regarding the various rules and regulations that are consistently changing and being updated regularly, so is our platform. We are keeping up with the sanctions, the watch list, the embargo, etc. We're keeping up on a regular basis within the platform, right? Third party risk manager compliance is the one I'm speaking to directly. So, as we have this ever changing world, and the compliance professionals are obligated to ensure that they're keeping up, part of that's done outside. That's your research and your homework and keeping up with the industry. But then when we talk about screening, going back to that, have we kept up with the regulatory changes? Yes. And pardon the following statement, but here's how those things happen. Companies don't do bad things, people do. And as people do, the regulatory landscape changes and it can change quickly. Yeah, it takes a long time to get through, but once it's implemented, it's like that. And it needs to be updated accordingly so that we can flag any potential risk through the screening and adjudication.
Michael, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us in our next episode where I visit with your colleague, Stephanie Font, and we're going to take a deep dive into questionnaires and due diligence. But before I leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on any of the topics we've touched on today, what would be the best place for them to go?
Just go to our website, www.diligent.com, or www, I should say. There is a host of information available on there. There's a bit to navigate. You'll see all of the products that Diligent offers, in addition to those that help with anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance. So navigate to that website, poke around, see what's available, and there's lots of resources available to you around this particular topic.
Michael, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for your time, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this part one of our special 5-part series on third-party management, a risk-based approach. I hope you'll join us tomorrow where we take up the questionnaire and due diligence with Stephanie Font. This 5-part podcast series is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.